Good afternoon. Welcome to our diversity panel at this year's NABO Chicago Conference. I'm Suzanne Griffith, the founder and managing partner of Vega Partners. We're a social impact firm here in Chicago, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's session. We have an hour with a hard stop at 4 p.m. So we're going to just dive right in. With me is the esteemed panel of Corliss, Garner, who's in the financial services realm and happens to represent the sponsor of today's session, First Midwest Bank. So thank you, Corliss. And then also you'll be hearing from Carolyn Dettman, who's in the creative space and an entrepreneur, a new entrepreneur and business owner. So we're excited about that. And then finally, Emma in the legal services space is gonna, sort of rally up our group. So with that, when talking about diversity, those of us who are practitioners in this field, people of color certainly, know that this work begins personally. So we thought it would be interesting to ask our panel that question. How do you come to this work first in terms of the personal space? And I actually want to start with Emma, and then just to tee it up, we'll go Emma, Carolyn, and then Corliss, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Sounds good. So I guess first, thank you to everybody who's attending. I'm glad you're taking the time to explore this issue. Sometimes as women, we think, oh, well, I'm a woman, so any issues of diversity, like I own already. But I think diversity is broader. And so I'm glad you're joining us today. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, so the issue of diversity is very personal because it shows in my face. But the reason why I do this work is because it is important for sort of from a business perspective and a community perspective. So I'm currently the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Legal and General Investment Management America, which is the U.S. arm of, or U.S. investment arm of Legal and General Group. Most people don't know us in the U.S., but we're actually the 4th largest asset manager worldwide. And we're a universal owner, which means we're so big, we own every possible public company in the world, which means we exert a lot of influence in that. And so diversity is critical for us as a universal owner, and we push a lot in that space. So from a work perspective, sort of required, but also from a personal perspective, I spend a lot of time with the Latino community. And throughout my whole career, have been in diversity committees and whatnot, but also in community organizations like the Association of Latino Professionals, where that's where I really personally learned that the issues of diversity and creating a diverse environment, an environment that all of us recognize where we can each learn and be better from each other, is grassroots. It's a human connection work. It is not a corporate policy work. And then finally, I also serve on the board of Angeles Investors, which is an angel investing group where we find, fund, and grow Latino-led businesses on the perspective that most Latinos do not have a rich uncle that can give them money to scale a business up, and that's where Angeles Investors come in. So those are the ways in which I engage with the community. But talking to women business owners, I should say, I am a product of a woman just like you. So my mom had her own small business just with a high school degree in Puerto Rico that over time and over 40 years grew into an international successful business. She graduated college when I was still in high school because she felt like she needed that check mark to be able to engage with business, mostly men, partners worldwide, even though at that point she had been doing it for like 20 years. But the reason why I am a loud, opinionated Latina businesswoman now is because of my mom and the life that my siblings and I and cousins and aunts and uncles and my own dad was employed by my mom was because of my mom's work. So to all of you listening, remember that what you're doing is important for your families and for your communities. And for that, I thank you. So that was a lot. So I'll kick it back to somebody else.
That was great. We're going to go Carolyn next. If you can share a little bit about your personal story, how you come to this.
Yeah, it's so personal. And Emma, you're a hard act to follow. So just to be clear, this is incredibly personal. And I'm probably a really good example of that. I am a relatively new part of this community. So first and foremost, thank you, because I've never been such a part of such a supportive community, number one. But where I started, I was in corporate America for 20 plus years in the creative space. So I was a chief creative officer for an advertising agency globally. And being a female chief creative officer was it's almost like being a unicorn. That whole industry is dominated by men, particularly white men. And so if you can imagine, only less than 3% when I was coming up of creative directors were women. Less than that were people of color. Now, what that essentially means is that more than 90% of what's being put out into the universe in terms of commercials, in terms of marketing ideas, does not reflect a female, right, or a minority point of view. And that troubled me to no end. And so post Me Too actually is when I realized I had a platform and I needed to use it. And I kind of channeled some of that anger coming out of that movement into trying to take some action. So I created a call to action for the advertising world called Have Her Back, because it was an industry that did not have her back. And I used it to hold myself accountable to making change, but also other agencies as well. And within about a 2-year time frame, by really being focused on this, we went from under 20% in terms of female and minority creatives in leadership positions to 47% by the time that I left. And we addressed pay equity across in that 2-year time frame. These are things that they said couldn't be done. And because of that, what ended up happening was we started doing events similar to this, talking about the steps that we had been taking. And we started getting attention from some of the biggest companies in the world saying, we understand that you're doing this in the advertising world, but the fact is we aren't good at this and we need help doing this. Can you help us? And so when you ask about personal, I had never envisioned myself being an entrepreneur, but I started to realize quite quickly that I had a purpose and I could really fulfill that purpose if I was actually focused on it 24/7 instead of this side hustle that I was running. So about a year ago, myself and two of my partners, we left very comfortable corporate gigs, right? To go and do this, to start a business, to really help companies tackle equity for all and do it differently and authentically. And so, the 3 founders were all women. We represent different ethnicities, different generations, and very different points of view. And it has been, as you can imagine, this year, a wild ride.
Yes, it has. Thank you for that. We're going to come back to a couple of things that you bring up, I think, as we continue. And so last but not least, Corliss.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, first of all, for having us. Those 2 stories are just incredibly inspiring, and I think it sets the tone for this very, very important conversation. I'll start a second by just saying, on behalf of Mike Scudder, who's our CEO at First Midwest, and all of our colleagues at First Midwest, we're really, truly delighted to be able to support NALBO in this incredible conversation with these incredible communities of women business owners. We've been with NALBO a long time, and we're really thrilled to play a role in this important conversation today. I want to give a quick special shout out to Elizabeth Colon, who's the president of the board of NALBO. In fact, she was recognized as an honoree in the First Midwest Inspiring Women in Business competition this year. So out of hundreds and hundreds of applications, her story of inspiration, how she cares for her clients, how she cares for her community, was one that was certainly worthy of uplifting. So to her, I want to say congratulations, as well as congratulations to the entire NALBO team for this incredible day, curating this incredible day. So for me, I come to you today by way of a single mother who was born to sharecropping parents. And if you know anything about sharecropping, it really was just a step above slavery. She was born to sharecropping parents in a small rural town in Mississippi. And if you can imagine that town in the 1940s, you can also imagine the levels of racism, sexism, classism, and just downright oppression that was just a part of her everyday existence. It was just the part of the fabric of people's lives in that town. And while my mother was truly a go-getter, she was a hard worker, and she was light years smarter than the 4th grade education that she was able to get. Just the weight of all of those isms really was just too much, and it never really allowed her to rise to her full potential. My mother, she passed away about 10 years ago, and since that time, I have been just really, really reflective on her life and asking myself, what if? What if those barriers of those isms had been removed for her, right? What kind of life would she have led? What kind of contributions could she have given to our society, to our community, to our family? And essentially, how would my life be different? So the quest to answer those questions, not only for myself and my family, but also for my colleagues at First Midwest and the communities that we serve, that is really what energizes me every day for this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right now, I serve as the head of corporate responsibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion at First Midwest, and I'm really, really privileged and honored to lead this work, not only for my colleagues, but for the outcomes that we can genuinely create in community. So I look forward to this conversation and this dialogue and learning more from these amazing co-panelists.
Thank you, and thank all of you for opening up and sharing your personal stories. I always learn a lot from listening to how other women traverse this world, right? And you often hear moments of just extreme courage. And, you know, Carolyn, Corliss, Emma, as all of you were describing your family history and what brings you to this moment, I jotted down the word brave, right? So, you know, we come from legacies of incredible courage. But as I think about our day-to-day world right now as leaders and business women who are, you know, leading parts of a company or having to build an entire enterprise themselves, you know, we find ourselves, I think, in moments where that courage is challenged. Sometimes on a daily basis, right? Corliss just mentioned all the isms. So I was wondering if, you know, we could share a little bit about where do you find that courage every day when you're encountering, you know, the challenges of corporate policy versus human connection, for example. And Carolyn, let me take it back to you because your enterprise is so new. You're building an enterprise. You're doing it in a collaborative fashion, intergenerational, intersectional, right? So we got all the buzzwords in there, but also that's very, very real, you know, in terms of how we build collaboration and underscoring lots of conversations about diversity and how we enact that in our environments is the notion of collaboration. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit to what happens and how do you address when those things bump up against each other?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's one of those things where if something doesn't scare me, I almost question if it's worth doing. It's almost gotten to that point. And so, you know, I have been asked a lot by reporters and other things like, you know, tell me about, are you fearless? And I'm always like, no, everything scares me. But as I get older, I think I fear less. Right. I think that's more kind of how I attack things. And I think it has been such a privilege to start this business with two badass women who bring different perspectives and different backgrounds and different family stories to the table. I'm so blessed. They make me better every day. And while this last year has been a challenging environment in which to start a business, I think what keeps me going is I'm building the business that I always wanted to work for and that corporate America really didn't necessarily offer, right? And at the same time, the business that we do every day is working with big companies that, again, it's almost harder for them to change because it's always boiling an ocean, right? And so getting in there and getting in the trenches and being sort of that outside in perspective that so often companies need, because it's hard to be brave within your own company. It's really hard. There are always trailblazers, and you're always going to find your kindred spirits, but it really helps to kind of surround yourself, right, with people who are not only saying that this is necessary on the inside, but they're coming from an outside perspective as well, right? So I think that's at least the way that I kind of handle when I come up against something. And then just always, you know, my curiosity is always like, okay, well, if that's a barrier, how do we get beyond it, right? And like one story I'll tell you, and of course, this is a big thing in small business, but when we were starting our business, we realized that women get less than 3% of VC funding, and we knew we needed funding. You know, that could have scared us from, frankly, not leaving our jobs, right? We're all moms. One partner's got 2 kids under 3 years old. I've got 3 teenage boys about to go to college. So there was never probably a good time to kind of walk away from something, to do something if we didn't ultimately know, would succeed. But having said that, we found a different way to get that investment that we needed, because we knew that the normal channels were probably really not available to us as women, as a minority-led, women-led business, right? So we got creative and we figured out another way to go to get that investment to start that business. So I think it's also use those barriers, use those moments to problem solve. And I think that really helps, and I don't even know if it's bravery, it's just, I'm gonna solve that problem.
That's great. I love, it's not that we're fearless, we just fear less. I mean, when I wear that t-shirt, you know where I got it. So thank you for that. And then, Emma and Corliss, you guys are in very risk-averse environments, right? Financial services and legal, very conservative environments, no matter how cool the marketing may look. So I would love to hear, Emma, you're not on mute, so let's go ahead and start with you. How do you deal with that on a daily basis in your work environment when you bump up against the challenges around advancing equity and inclusion?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think we talk about people needing to be courageous with diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think just even saying they need to be courageous makes people scared, like they have to do something big. And that's where I think there's a misconception. I think the level of courage that's required of people depends on the level of power that they have. And I also think it's unfair to ask a very junior person, right, that sees something bad to be required to put their life and career on the line to call something out very publicly, right, in a business. And so I always think of, how do you create an environment for your employees where they can be courageous at the level and in the way that they choose to do it, where they can flow that information up and say, I saw something that's wrong. And the reason why you need to create that is because it's difficult to have these conversations, not because I think there's racism. I always say it would be easy if somebody was a complete racist. You would just tell them to their face, you're a complete racist and you're fired, right? That's not hard. The hard thing is you put a room of not racist, really thoughtful people who want to value diversity and inclusion, and somehow we create a system that creates racist outcomes. There's no other way to talk about it. 1% goes to people of color, right? But was that on purpose? I don't think so. But somehow we created
lost your sound. Can you guys hear Emma, or is it just?
I can hear her. I can hear her.
Okay.
Yeah. So somehow people who aren't trying to do something wrong create systems that produce bad outcomes. And those are the difficult conversations that I think need courage and need people of power, and frankly, people who are not people of color, to step up to handle those. So for me, what I always think about is, given my role within the organization, I am a person of power, right? So if I see it, I know that I need to speak up because that's what I have to do, because other people can't. And so when I think of courage, that's what I tell myself. Those other people can't publicly speak up if they see this because they're worried about their jobs, versus I'm the general counsel, right? I can say if I see something wrong, even if it's just an outcome. But for a small business, as the people who are here, right, if primarily, I think a lot of you are small business owners, I think there's an extra level of being courageous around how you engage with your clients. And that's a little bit harder for a small business than it is for a large conglomerate like us, right? Like when we go to our vendors, we can say, I want diversity reporting. I want this. I want to know that. I want that my teams are diverse, right? Here's what I need. If I'm not, you're going to get fired. Like we have the leverage to do that. When you're a small business owner, you're sometimes in the position where you're like, I need to do business because I need to keep my business afloat. And I just don't have the luxury of really like digging deep on who my clients and vendors are. And there again, I say, you don't have to be like, I'm not going to do business with you and I'm not going to take your money because you're this person. Maybe there's a way to engage with your clients and your vendors that allow for a diversity conversation that allows you to build a relationship that isn't that sort of, I only work with these type of people. So I don't know if Corliss, given that you are in a banking institution that works with a lot of, women business owners and diverse businesses, if you have a perspective on that as well.
I love that segue.
Yeah, I think the point that you made about courage or bravery and what that looks like based on the position that you're in is certainly a very, very important point. I remember listening to Melody Hobson, another fantastic badass woman, right? Who she gave a commencement address to USC, and this had to be about 5 years ago. And the theme of it was bravery. And the thing that I took away from that conversation was you don't have to have these big, powerful leaps of actions that will depict how brave you are. Small, bite-sized pieces of action based on where you are and where you're trying to go is just fine to exercise your level of bravery. So when you think about a conservative industry such as financial services, I think you just have to think about the varying ways you can approach the work, right? You can approach it from a systems perspective, which to your point, I think systems carry outcomes that are not necessarily intentional outcomes, but outcomes nonetheless that are hurtful and detrimental to communities. So as you look at those systems, where can you create change within those systems that start to move outcomes in a different direction? So that's one approach. The other approach is with the people, right? So people actually perpetuate the system. So if you only touch the system and not really look at the people behind the system and how you can help educate and help create different perspectives and help open dialogue and create open-mindedness. If you don't take that approach as well, I don't think you have a complete way of approaching the work and looking at the work that helps to accelerate us to better outcomes. So I think it's just important to think about all of the different ways that the work can be approached, and also be very mindful of where you are in your journey in the work and what does bravery look like for you.
Yeah, thank you. And, I love that we're now talking about systems and people and systems and processes, because those systems and processes are not agnostic to the people who, as Corliss just said, perpetuate it, the people who build them, carry them, right? They're internalized. That is culture. And so before you know it, we have a culture of XYZ, even though it may be hard to articulate. So Corliss, we want to hear a little bit more from you, because you kind of segged us into thinking about, internal processes and systems. And, as Emma pointed out, you have these outcomes that you're just surprised that we landed here, but it really shouldn't be a surprise, because oftentimes it's built, right, with these biases. So as a practitioner of this work, and having to identify and lead and figure out the systems changes, whether it's a small company, a new company that's just starting out, or a very established business or corporation, maybe a couple pointers, if you will, about how do you go about looking for where there might be some fault lines in your processes and systems. And then, to all of you, then what, right?
Yeah.
So I think instinctively we're going to be like, well, how do I look for the problem? Because from where I sit, I don't necessarily see one. And then when I go look for it, then what do I do?
Right, right. Great question. I think it's important to start with data, right? So the data does not lie. It gives you the facts and it tells you kind of where you are. When you start with that data, then you can start to ask yourself some questions like, well, how did we end up with, I don't know, 5% women on in a leadership role, for example, when maybe we have 50% of women as our workforce. Like, what happened in between the 5% and the 50%? So that's when you start to dig and start to ask questions, and you start to look at things like your talent systems and how are people being promoted, or what type of opportunities are women getting in the firm, or how are they being sponsored? How are they being mentored? You start to dig into all of the inputs into the system. And, if you're asking yourself the hard questions and giving yourselves the honest answers, I think you will find out where you have gaps and where you can start to move toward more equitable outcomes. So I think an important place to start is with kind of where you are today. What does the data tell you where you are today? But I think it's also important to think about, as a leader of a business, as the leader of a company, what is your intention? What do you want to do? Set a vision, and be intentional about that vision. It's an issue that can be solved just like any other business issue, right? When we think about businesses and how they attack problems and how they think about strategic planning, you identify what your issue is, you put a plan in place, you execute that plan, and then you measure against that plan. I don't see diversity, equity, and inclusion any different than that, right? If it's being thought about in a strategic way. So starting with the data, setting your intention, creating the plan, and executing yourself toward that plan, that's will start to help you think about how you create more equitable outcomes.
So I want to go to Carolyn because you definitely started with the data, right? You just looked at the creative sphere and you're like, whoa, what is happening here? And then as an entrepreneur, you looked at more data and had to work around that. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe expound a little bit on your story too and what you found in the data.
No, absolutely. So look, Corliss is 1,000% right. Like, I don't know if you saw me, but I'm like, because the data is everything, right? And so at Have Her Back, as an example, the reason why we needed to go get that investment that I talked about earlier is because we wanted to have research and data that we could leverage, right? And that was a big part of that. And so we have this thing called the arc of authenticity. Our whole business model is helping companies move from good intentions, because, by the way, by far and away, people and companies have good intentions. Where they struggle is moving from good intentions to intentional action, right? And so you start with the data to find out where the barriers are, where the problems are. And every company, no matter what size you are, you're going to have different issues that the data is going to reveal to you. But I'll tell you, now that I've been at this now for several years, what every company struggles with is exactly what Corliss talked about, which is you've got diversity, right, in the junior ranks, and you don't have them in the manager and leadership ranks. I haven't yet worked with a company where this is not an issue, right? And so there are major things that are happening in that space that we have to be focused on. And so I like to also say that it's not just processes that you need to be taking. What we're really talking about here is changing human behavior. That's what we're really talking about. And so in order to do that, there is a lot of fatigue around, okay, what are you asking me to do now, right? Like, that's just a human response. This is where I think my background in creative comes in, because we like to use the power of creative and ideas to inspire people to change their behavior. Right. So, I'm going to give you like a good example of this. So as an example, one of the things that happens in many corporations, again, regardless of size, is how you recruit typically is through the people you know. right? And some companies go as far as to have a absolute referral program, right? That is actually incentivized to bring in people that you know. But even if it's just word of mouth, that tends to be who you bring in, people like yourself. Well, just that in and of itself, right, perpetuates the issue, right? And so we need to think differently. So for one of our clients, who's one of the biggest technology companies in the world, we're actually saying we're going to disband their incentivized referral program. And instead, we are for the first time going to incentivize people within the company at every level to bring in people not like them, right? And so it's getting people to think differently and change their own behaviors. Now, it's one thing to say that we're going to do that. It's another thing to arm and equip people with how to do that, because it's not that easy to go out and recruit people not like you. You need to expand your networks. You need to know how to go and do that. So we're doing all of these trainings around how exactly to do that. So that is just one little small example, but I think ultimately we really have to inspire people, particularly in D&I, because you are talking about changing a behavior. And as a former creative in the advertising world, this is what we do all the time. We inspire people with ideas to go buy products that you probably don't need, right? But you're inspired to go do that. Is you're changing that behavior. It's no different here. We just need to inspire more, right? And I think for all leaders, the best way to inspire is to live it yourself.
So Emma, I have a sneaking suspicion you're going to bring us another nuanced perspective on this question.
Yeah, I actually agree with everything, but I get a little bit more granular. And the reason is I am 100% on the you need to start with data and intentionality. The reason why I think data is important is it lets you really understand what you're going to go after as your diversity and inclusion initiative. People, when they think of diversity and inclusion, they always think recruiting, like change our numbers. I always call it the numbers issue. Our numbers look bad. We need to change our numbers. That's just one aspect of diversity and inclusion. There's a big chunk of businesses, whether they are small businesses or they are businesses that are big but have very little turnover. We're changing the numbers. You can't do it magically right away unless you're just going to fire people and lay off people. I'm going to lay off all these people so I can recruit new people, right? Unless you do that in a small business or in a business with very little turnover, it would take 15 years to actually change the numbers. And so for me, I always say you need to look at the data. You also need to be self-aware about how your business operates, and then set your KPI, so your target on what you're trying to change and do based on what you can actually accomplish in a, let's say, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year range, or maybe 10 year. Maybe in 10 years, you really do want your numbers to look better because you think you'll have enough turnover to do that. And so I bring that up because there's so many other things that people who are committed to creating a diverse and inclusive environment can do outside of just the numbers game, but that's the only thing people talk about. And it includes, for example, looking at your vendors. Who do you work with? Why do you work with those people? Could you work with somebody different? In 1 year, I don't recommend changing all of your vendors. That's going to be incredibly disruptive for your business. You could set a target that says within 3 years, we want 60% of our vendors to be women or diverse, right? You could do that if you know not just the data about what your numbers say about your diversity and inclusion, but literally the data of how you hire and when you hire vendors. How often do we hire? Where could we hire? Which ones could we rotate out as quickly as possible? That's the sort of data that will allow you to actually execute on your target. And so I always start there, because when we talk about data, it is not just your recruiting numbers. It really is all of that. And then completely agree on the changing behavior. That is such a hard thing to do. And there are a variety of people who disagree on how you actually do that. But I am a firm believer that diversity and inclusion needs to be owned straight at the top, with the CEO and led by the CEO and the executive team, and needs to be owned there. And by owned there, I literally mean they need to own the outcomes from a compensation and performance perspective. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that they need to be responsible for the lack of numbers necessarily. They need to be responsible, but for whatever diversity and inclusion goal and KPI is set, whether that's vendor related, whether that's training for employees. Okay, we don't have turnover. We can't turn our employees that quickly, but maybe we can make our employees better. we commit to actually doing diversity and inclusion training and paying consultants and experts for it, not random people in your office, to actually come and train our employees to be better in their communities, to do better in their communities. And maybe we can't change our numbers, but we can change our people. Those are the sort of things that I think when people actually start to think about, oh, I can do more, even in small businesses, and even in, you know, for us as an investment advisor, we really don't have that much sort of turnover. You can do things there. So that would be the nuance I would add. There's a place for everybody to do something, but hold your executives accountable, meaning tie it to compensation.
Yeah, I was hoping somebody would bring that up, right? But I want to continue to thread too about, you know, and Emma, as you call it, the human connection. So thinking about, you know, the firms, right, large and small, there is people like me and Carolyn who are founders and owners of companies. And then there are other layers, right? And certainly you and Corliss represent, you know, leadership at the next layer of a company. What do we do then, right? Because it's easy for me to drive certain values in my company. Carolyn and your founder, your co-founders can do that. But, you know, as companies are stratified, how do you hold the next layer accountable, particularly as you guys have brought up this changing of behavior? You know, I think about the pushback that we often hear about, well, I just don't know other people. And that's just not true, right? So diversity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't only exist amongst people of color, right? It just is. And so I think it's a fallacy actually that we get caught up in the numbers game. So as we grow and, you know, talking about this from a leadership perspective, right? The lieutenants, if you will, in our companies that we have to rely on, whether it's business unit or even an administrative function. What advice might you have for our audience around how do you push these values through the company? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. I think you probably have the answer in the question. The values of a company should stand whether the company is a 5-person firm or a 50,000-person firm. And how those values are stratified across the company is a function of the leadership. You know, the leadership embodies those values and they model those values. And when it's done well and when it's done right, I think it does permeate throughout the organization and it creates that culture that's based on those values. So it's important to define that for yourself as a company and then live it and then hold others accountable to it. So I think it's really important that whatever those values are for your company, they should certainly include some level of what is your view and vision on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how do you build that into the values of your company, and then how do you action that, not only with your employees, but with your workplace environment. Based on what Emma said, there are various ways to execute DE&I within your company, but also within your communities. So empowering your employees to demonstrate those values in the community. It creates this ecosystem that is difficult to break apart with DE&I at the center of it.
Thank you. Other thoughts, additions?
No, that's perfect. I agree. I always say if the CEO and the executive team can get the second line managers to actually execute on the business strategy, there should be no excuse for executing on the diversity and inclusion strategy because that's part of the business strategy. And so there are issues, of course, but it requires you to really be thoughtful about, you know, your culture and how you sort of push it down.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go back to being women and talk about the burden of this, right? This is a women's organization and we're all women, and all the women I know personally and professionally are inimitably, passionate about this and are strong allies, passionate leaders. They're not afraid to push. But it also tires us out. A girlfriend of mine said the other day that someone asked her, or she said, why is it that it's Black women leading this work right now, right? And he's a white guy, and he says to her, well, no one else can do it the way you guys can. No offense to any other women, right? But in their organization, he was saying, no one else is going to do this as effectively as it needs to be done. And she just groaned, and she's like, we're tired, right? And I think, regardless of your ethnicity, I think women get tired of having to carry this. So I would love to hear from you guys around, where do you re-energize? How do you find that energy again? Because we all have these amazing inspirational stories, right, that we're rooted in our family histories, our professional path, all the things that we found. But it's a lot sometimes.
I'll jump. I'm a fan of naps. I love a good nap, right? I love a good nap, and it just it completely re-energizes me, and especially during the pandemic. I don't know about you guys, but I find myself working a lot more by being at home and trying to isolate and doing the right thing. So I'm working a lot. So I do not give up a good nap time, because it really does just help me reset and then get back in it with a bit of refreshment. And I say that in jest. It is funny, but it is totally true.
That's why she looks so glowing and refreshed for this session. Okay, so you guys jump in, and we're beginning to get questions in our Q&A. So guys, please send us more questions, because as we get ready to wrap up in the next 20 or so minutes, we'd love to get your questions answered. But we'll hear from Emma and Carolyn.
I'll jump in. I have a 3-year-old, so I have no luxury of naps. And I was sitting here listening to Corliss and just being completely jealous. So, it's interesting. My answer would have been completely different in like pre-COVID times. And it was very stressful for me with COVID, and among the stresses for everybody, and this is clearly a first world problem, but sort of mentally trying to figure out how to create moments of motivation for myself when everything was so overwhelming and you're stuck at home. Right before, I'd be like, we booked a trip to Hawaii, like something like that. It's like, okay, we booked a trip to the living room. And it was really hard to change that perspective of getting joy and excitement from the little things and the everyday things. That was personally challenging for me. And it took me easily like 2 months of depression at the beginning of the pandemic to get there. And honestly, once I realized, okay, part of the challenge for me is I'm a type A person, and my day is now completely out of my control. It is very overwhelming sort of working in this environment, but all of life is outside of my control. There's so much uncertainty. I don't know when I'm going to see my mom next. I don't know when I'm going to see my siblings, right? Everything is outside of my control. And I realize this sounds weird, I get joy from having those little things that I can control, that I can plan, that I can look forward to. So I reserve time on my weekend for that now. I say on Saturday, these are my 2 hours, not to necessarily be by myself. Like last weekend was, I'm going to make homemade coconut paletas with my son. We're going to make them from scratch. And I planned everything. We had our recipe and we delivered, and then it rained the next day and we couldn't eat them. But it felt like I was actually motivated to plan and be able to do something. I don't think I would have ever answered this way pre-COVID times, but now it's those little things that I can control that really motivate me to try to do help, for example, in diversity and inclusion, which is so hard, and change comes so slow sometimes. Yeah. So.
Okay. So I don't have a young child. I have 3 teenage boys. So we could have a whole nother discussion about what that's like. But I don't sleep. I'm just not a sleeper. So one of the things that I'll say about this pandemic that has been a positive is that I'm not commuting. So I'm using that time to go on hikes, just me and my dog. And that is, and I've done it. I have not missed a morning since it started. So that means if it's pouring rain outside, you'll still see me out there, but it's like, it's my time to just kind of think, listen to maybe some important podcasts, just as importantly, listen to some real trash ones too, right? Like, it's just, it's kind of like whatever I'm in the mood to do. And I think that's a part of like my recharge. So I protect it despite the weather, doesn't matter. And let's be honest, who has it the best during this pandemic is definitely our pets, for sure. But I think the other piece, because you said this, Emma, I think the work that we do is really hard, right? Like, it's a challenging job that we all have. And so I will say, being a mother of 3 young white men, I feel an extra responsibility to raise good men. And we have our moments, but there have been real moments of pride during all of this, right? So whether it was being a part as a family of the Black Lives Matter marches, right? Whether it's we're watching and we're hearing some political, very distressing news, and my 14-year-old starts saying, nope, that's not okay, and it's like these little moments that we have where I'm saying, okay, right? Like they get it. And it's really important that they get it, because guess what? They're our next allies, right? And to be a part of this change. So again, very different answers, some purely just me time, and some just like because of the work we're doing, just moments of just pride where I'm going, okay, we're creating allies. That's good.
No, I think it's all important. And I like to hear what everyone else does, because it makes it okay that I do what I do. And so I'm with the napping, I'm with the eating, I'm with all of that. And I'm getting there, right? I am trying to work out a lot more, but I think the meditation, in whatever way we do that, right? And center ourselves as part of what re-energizes us. So thank you, ladies, for that. We're gonna switch, I think, the tone a little bit and start tackling the Q&A. And let's see how that goes. And we might be ending a tad early if we don't get a flurry of questions. And that's okay, I think, right? So, in the discussion around data, one of our questions from the audience was, where do we access the metrics for data as it's related to our specific industry, size of business, that kind of thing. So any go-to resources for where to look for the data for our various industries?
Yeah, I can tackle that one. There are a few resources out there that will help you with some benchmarking for industry. So diversity best practices is one. Gartner, I think it's Gartner, Gartner, is another resource that will help with some benchmarking around your particular industry. Obviously, your data is unique to you, and you can pull that through whatever systems that you have in your company. But if you're looking for benchmarking, best practices around what others are doing in the industry, those are 2 resources that could be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, any association within your industry, at some point may have gathered some of this information. I feel like right now everyone is, taking another tack at it. And so more and more reports are coming out. We work in the intersection of the, philanthropic and social responsibility world. So, we're seeing new reports come out all the time about, what foundations are doing, or, what businesses are doing, and then trying to take some action from that. So recommendation would be, start looking at some of the industry associations and asking a question. Any other additions to that? Okay, great. And so thank you, exactly what I was looking for, yay. Another question from Stephen Lease is, how are you including and involving allies to help share the work? I think Stephen might be picking up on that piece of the discussion around getting tired, right? Carrying the burden, so to speak. involving allies. And Carolyn, you literally just brought this up in talking about your sons.
Yeah, I think this is critical. And I think first you've got to recognize that, that potential allies exist. They're often a little bit afraid to be vulnerable and saying they don't know what to do. Right. And so I think part of it is inviting them in to be, and also making it okay to be vulnerable, because this is a vulnerable space. Right. And so if you think about, you know, business leaders as they come up, particularly men, right, they're trained not to be vulnerable. They should have all the answers, right? And so what we're seeing oftentimes is there's a deferral, particularly in the areas of DEI, to women and to underrepresented groups to carry that weight. And we need to explain to them why that's so tiring and why that isn't the right way to go. And in fact, we're counseling companies, a lot of larger companies, right? They have employee resource groups, right, that exist, right, to be a place for underrepresented groups to come together. And oftentimes the leaders of those groups are doing those jobs as side hustles above their paying job. And there is a lot expected of them to also carry the weight and the perspective of that group forward for the company. We're saying that's actually unpaid labor. You can't do that. This is not a volunteer opt-in anymore. We have to recognize that this is real labor that we're asking for. So I know that's not necessarily the ally question, but I do think it's important to point that out. And it's also important, if you are that person being asked to be that person, right, to represent and to give your perspective, that it's okay to say that you're tired, right? And they need someone else to step forward. So I think that's an important point. On the allies front, I just find that don't assume that they're not there. They oftentimes don't know that you need them to step up. I'll give you an example. There are all these conferences. This one included women conferences, right? And oftentimes you look around like, why aren't the men here? Like, they need to be here. They need to be hearing all of this. They need to be acting on all of this. And I started asking some colleagues of mine, men that I believe are allies, about it, right? And it was so interesting. Just by asking that question, they said, we were worried that if we took a seat, that would take a seat away from a woman who should rightly be there, right? So again, it's like the intention is there, right? The impact may be different, but the intention is there. So we need to engage in conversations to bring that out in people. And I find more often than not that when you can have sort of those vulnerable discussions, I think you get to a really good place, and they are looking for direction, right? How can we help? And I think we have to be honest and tell them.
Yeah.
And I would add 2 points to that, which is, even if it's an ERG or for small companies that don't have employee resource groups, and you're just like the few of us who want to do it this space, remember that you're building a diverse coalition of people to tackle diversity and inclusion, and that includes everybody. And so if you are in one of these groups and you do not literally see white people there, or white men in particular, you did not build a diverse team to tackle diversity and inclusion. And that, I think, sometimes gets missed. And that's where I think the executive team has responsibility for saying, we need to bring others to this table that are missing, because this is a problem for all of us. So that's one. And then the second, I also frankly believe it's allies' responsibilities to actually step up and say, I want to be an ally or help, because otherwise, I hate when people do this. We'll put a plan out there. We're like, this is the strategy. This is what we do. I'm supportive. Let me know how I can help you. I was like, great. You just gave me the work of figuring out what you need to do now, instead of you figuring it out on your own. And so I raise that up because I think when we talk to our employees as the executive team, we need to tell people, you need to be an ally. We expect our employees to be an ally. The alternative is not, I'm not an ally. The alternative is you're fired. Everybody here is supporting diversity and inclusion. Now, who wants to step up to the plate to actually make stuff happen? And you get some people who actually have the time or want to do it or whatever it is, but everybody there is an ally. And so I always say that because there's no other alternative for them, let's just say.
Yeah, there was a study maybe a year ago by one of the top 4 consulting firms that found, I mean, a very high percentage of people who believed in allyship, right? And then, here was the gap, like, yes, I'm an ally, I believe in this, I sign up for it, very low engagement. So thank you, Emma, I think, for raising that point. And then I think, Carolyn, you know, the notion of going and asking the question, like instinctively, I think you're on board with this, but why aren't you here? Why aren't you doing more? And building that understanding is a part of it.
Can I add on a quick notion? And I think back to the allyship question, I've had a couple of instances where white people would say to me, well, I'm hesitant about entering this conversation because I'm going to say the wrong thing. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And my response to that is always, you probably will say the wrong thing, and that's okay, because saying nothing is not an option, and that gets us nowhere. So I think with respect to allyship, you may have that gap because people are like, I'm on the fence, I'm on the line, I don't want to offend, I don't want to make things worse. So have grace and space for people and invite them into the conversation and let them know it will be bumpy. It's gonna be bumpy until we find the smooth road. And we don't find the smooth road until we actually start to have those bumpy conversations.
Thank you for that. I'm going to come back to a comment I'll make about allyship, which is, you know, one of the mentors in the diversity space that is a mentor of mine. You know, she talks about moving beyond allyship, and that allyship, you know, there's a passivity to that, right? So she likes to challenge people to be co-conspirators, and I like that. I like being able to say, co-conspire with me on solving this, attacking this, advancing this, because it's an energetic word. It evokes a lot of feelings, right? So that's how we tend to talk about it, is that, you know, allyship is a part of that journey, but what we really need are for diverse teams to be co-conspirators in breaking down the structures and the systems that keep racism intact. We have another question, which kind of goes back to some of the things we were talking about. How can we get our employees more engaged in changing the culture internally without feeling that they are now becoming the minority? Who wants to decode that one?
I'm pausing because I'm trying to figure out if the question is, the situation is I have employees who are used to the team as it is, and getting new people who happen to be diverse people is difficult. Because I hope the situation it is not, I have a team who's not diverse and getting diverse people in here just because they're diverse is difficult. I think that's a different answer, but
yeah, or my read on it is, you know, how does the dominant culture, right? People who are part of the dominant culture not feel like they're becoming the minority.
Yeah, I think that's how I read it. And that speaks to this notion of privilege, right? And what does that mean for different people? I don't know that I have a good answer for that, right? I mean, really it is, when we look at our environment and our world and how our world is changing, it is becoming a more diverse world. That's data, right? That's back to that data. Our environment is shifting. And with that, certainly things that have historically been true, we're probably moving a little bit away from that. So I think it's up to companies to help support employees, whether you're a diverse employee or not, in that shift. That is through education, it's through open dialogue, it's through traveling down that bumpy road that I just mentioned. In some respects, you know, the world is just changing, and it's up to a company and the leader to help their employees understand what does that change mean for them inside of their companies.
Yeah, really quickly, this question, I completely understand and we get it. And I know there's this saying about like, this isn't pie, right? Like, But the reality is that, yeah, it means that the privileged are going to lose some of that privilege. But I'd like to direct that conversation to one of, let's not focus on what we're losing. Let's actually focus on all that we're gaining.
Sure.
Right? And as a business, the business case for diversity is more than proven. Your business will be more successful if you have more diversity at the table, right? And so there are so many benefits. And I think the biggest one, which we've seen come into play in such a new sense of urgency this summer with this pandemic, is that culture is finally on our side. Right. And so if you aren't thinking this way, if you aren't building your business, right, you're not going to be fit for future. Right. So I think I really would say, focus on all that you are gaining, not what you are losing.
Yeah, I would add the education is key, but at some point accountability is also key. You do not want an environment where, as you are instituting changes, you're bringing diverse people into an environment that is hostile and where they are made to feel like they are changing something that the people who were there liked it just the way it was. And so educate for sure, but at some point you as the executive need to choose what values you want in your team and in your people.
And we are going to have to leave it there. I hope for those of you who, added more comments and questions in the chat that you got some of that answered in these last few remarks. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you, First Midwest Bank, Corliss, Garner, Emma Rodriguez-Ayala, and Carolyn Dettman. I'm Suzanne Griffith of Vega Partners, and thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.